Lovely. It's just scholarly for statistics course. Oh, okay. Auntie says, yay, post-structuralism. I keep trying to make heads or tails of it, even when I don't find it interesting. All right, well, that's what this is. This is post-structuralism. I'm not a post-structuralist. I'm not a continental philosopher, so we'll see how this goes. But this is chapter 4 of the political philosophy of post-structuralist anarchism by Todd May. When is this even from? I don't even know. I don't know anything about this. You have no idea. None whatsoever. 1994? Okay. I think 94. Viper says, one way to start thinking about the democratization of the provision of basic communities is decentralizing them. Yeah. If you get it to spread out and people are making their own stuff and being, yeah. So, like, the centralization of, like, all the power and, like, you know, the big businesses here in the United States is really not great for the individual person. Same year as Weezer's first album, so it was good, easy. Yeah, early Weezer, good stuff. Yeah. Yeah, basic needs need to be baked into housing infrastructure and will go a long way towards strengthening national democracies against neoliberalism. Yeah, it would be really nice if there was enough housing and food and healthcare to go around, which there should be because we can afford to do that in at least most westernized countries, or at least the United fucking States. But do we do that? No, we don't, because we're terrible people. All right. But this is chapter 4 of political philosophy of post-structuralist anarchism, the positivity of power and the end of humanism. Yeah, it's clustered power, but everywhere. Nice ballroom? Yeah. We got a nice ballroom in DC. Exactly. Quote, if it is true that the juridical system was useful for representing, albeit in a non-exhaustive way, a power that was centered primarily around deduction and death, it is utterly incongruous with the new methods of power whose operation is not ensured by right but by technique, not by law but by normalization, not by punishment but by control, methods that are employed at all levels and in forms that go beyond the state and its apparatus. Okay, so we're already getting into this sense where there's, I don't know this stuff, but like there's older systems where the government would act in one way and you'd punish you if you did something. And then nowadays what happens is they set things up to, like, you know, coerce you into acting in certain ways. And so that's what it is. You're not getting, you're not doing anything. They're not giving you stuff by rights, but by technique, what you're allowed to do, because this is what how the government sets the world up, or how society sets stuff up. That's what you're allowed to do. It's not by right what you're allowed to do. It's not by law, but by the way the way society is normalized. So you're not like punished when certain things go wrong. You're already controlled into acting in certain ways. So yeah. Viper says, I love watching YouTube videos where Americans react to American labor laws compared to other countries. There's so many what the fucks. Yeah, well, educating Americans, like, amazing. Yeah, this is Foucault from The History of Sexuality. Can you see the pop-up box? Yes, you can. You go from public executions to surveillance state. Yeah, and we're like in, I guess, almost post-surveillance capitalism, the Zuboff. Yeah, we're in like surveillance capitalism or some weird capitalism at the moment. Anyway, continuing. That power is always a matter of constraints upon action. That power is always a matter of constraint upon action does not imply that we must define those constraints in terms of restraints. The juridico-discursive model of power, as Foucault calls it, mistakenly cites the dominant mode of the operation of power several centuries ago as the model for all operations of power. Viper says, reminds me of the famous Chomsky quote, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, end quote. Yeah, and this is a known technique now. You allow very lively debate within certain boundaries, so it gives the appearance that there's actually been discussion when, as long as you don't get outside what the government wants, they're perfectly happy to let people argue back and forth. Yeah, lets them blow off steam. Yep. We got a lot of that in the U.S. and probably even more of it nowadays, where it's all a fake argument back and forth because none of it's really challenging the power structures. Okay. What we have called the suppressive assumption regarding power, if appropriate to understanding a certain historical period, is mistaken when it is taken to be the definition of power rather than one of its modes of enactment. Moreover, our continuing to think of power juridically or suppressively is not merely a mistaken view of power, it is not merely an epistemological problem. Like many epistemological concerns, is a political concern as well. If the post-structuralists have spent so much time focusing on the interaction between power and knowledge, it is because they recognize that much of what we say we know is not independent of the power relationships in which we are enmeshed, and in fact is partially a product of those relationships. In this, they can be said to take seriously the Marxist concept of ideology, although they remove it from its subordination to the economic substructure. If the post-structuralists are right, then the suppressive assumption about power is a politically significant act, as is the blindness the anarchists display by endorsing it. Yeah, so if you say you know economics, well, you know the economics that you are allowed to learn in whatever society you're in. You are allowed to understand that in a certain way, and that is going to be a politically significant thing because there won't be money to fund economics and theories that go against the power structures. There just aren't. So that's kind of how it's going to go. And that's the whole point of saying, look, power is politically significant and the epistemology is tied into that because you're just not going to have the opportunity to learn other views. Okay, so Unreal says, I'm suspecting that May's work too will be rather dated, not taking into account network, social media, society. Yeah, if it's from 1994, we're talking like the first gasps of the World Wide Web were just happening at that point. So it's going to be dated in terms of a lot of contemporary society. Yeah, like in Viper's point out, social media is a modern coliseum where we all root for our own personal gladiatorial avatar. Yeah, it's like that sort of stuff was... Maybe they could see it like a glimmer of it off in the future, but it's, that was still kind of beyond at that point. Starting, like, you could get people starting to see stuff, figure it out, but it wouldn't be developed at this point. Continuing. For Deleuze, knowledge is always an effect, it comes afterward. What is primary are relationships among forces. Across the entirety of the Deleuzian corpus runs the assumption first articulated in his early book on Nietzsche that, quote, the history of a thing in general is the succession of forces which take possession of it and the coexistence of forces which struggle for possession, end quote. What constitutes a force in Deleuze's thought changes with his texts, or better, with the subject matter of those texts. In his book on Nietzsche, there are active forces and reactive forces. In Anti-Oedipus, there are forces of desire, which is conceived as producing, not lacking. And social forces. In his book on Foucault, there are forces of power. In all cases, though, what is crucial about forces is their division into those which are, in some sense, life-affirming and those which are life-denying. And in all cases, what is crucial about knowledge is that it is always the result of complex forces. What we must come to grips with if we are to understand our world are the forces that constitute us and our knowledge, rather than the knowledge that is merely a product of those forces. Yeah, so keep in mind for all you people out there that are not like post-structuralists, not continentals, we're in a force metaphysics here. That goes back to Aristotle. This is one of the reasons I think Aris actually hates a lot of these people, because he knows the metaphysics. You're just being shitty Aristotelian sometimes when you appeal to forces. And so you're treating you've got like forces in the world, and that's just kind of how it goes. And you have to remember, so you have innate powers, you can call those forces. And so there are innate powers out in like, social, political structures that are affecting things. And that's fundamental. And that's where, you're getting your epistemology from this institutional power. But remember, the whole point of it is that the power is granting you the knowledge. It's saying this is economic knowledge and this is what you learn, but that's given to you because they have the institutional power. The power is the fundamental thing. Kapar says, yes, forces, but not in terms of their identity before difference. Deleuze puts difference as primary, not discrete force, but differential, voltage, potential. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's going to be... I don't know enough about this to like make fine distinctions here, but I do know the general metaphysics, going on. what was that, Whitehead, The History of Philosophy is Footnotes to Plato, Aris, The History of Continental Philosophy is Excrements of Aristotle. You know, I say this a lot, but there aren't that many good metaphysicians out there. Aristotle is one of them. Heidegger is a good metaphysician too. So it's like you're gonna be drawing on one of them. Like you really will be. Plato is suspect at times, but like Aristotle is a good metaphysician. Plato is a metaphysician, maybe not. It depends how you feel about him, like good or bad, but like he is one. Yeah. But like you're gonna be drawing on some theory like this because frankly there just aren't that many options for good metaphysics. Okay, the objection might be raised to Deleuze here that if knowledge is seen as a product of forces, doesn't this preclude at the outset any knowledge of those forces? And if so, hasn't Deleuze fallen into a self-refuting epistemological relativism? How could he know that knowledge itself is constituted by forces outside it? What makes for a good versus bad metaphysical person? It's not metaphysical person. When I say a good metaphysician, I mean someone who's good at writing metaphysics. Like they understand sort of these big questions of fundamental issues in the world and they talk about them. So like Heidegger, I say, is a good metaphysician. He goes against Descartes. Like he's anti-dualist and he finds a way to be anti-dualist. That shit's hard. Okay, people have been very sort of like mind-body dualists since Descartes, and even before that, like there was already this distinction. Like Descartes made it very clear, but like the fact that like Heidegger like found some way to non-dualize our world and do a metaphysics that was not dualist after 500 years of this sort of assumption going on, that's not easy. Aristotle got these forces, and like he's got like the hylomorphic theory of matter, where matter is like, you know, formed stuff. Like that's not like, it sounds obvious, but that's only because it's been 2,500 years of us understanding, you know, we have stuff in form and like, and it's shaped in a certain way. It's a stamped, like, so like pencil, you know, pencil. Well, what is this? Well, you've got the wood stuff in this sort of shape with like, you know, graphite in that shape. It's, you know, shaped, formed, stamped matter. And it's like, you can still use the Aristotelian theory in a very, very natural, convenient, everyday way. It still makes a whole lot of sense. So it's like the fact that you can talk about stuff in the Aristotelian way is like, that's because his metaphysics were good. He understood how we discuss, how we understand things. Yeah. Neil says, I have a pet peeve about the word metaphysician, which would be totally off topic. That's how I phrased the question. Yeah, I mean, so I was at my childhood friend's for Thanksgiving, and I've known her forever. She's known me since literally since like 5 or 6 or 7, something like that. And I met her cousin a few years ago, and I was telling him whatever I was writing, I wrote on, and I said I write on metaphysics and like some other stuff and like logic. But he heard metaphysics and he thought I was like, you know, playing with crystals and stuff. And nothing against playing with crystals, but he was like, well, he's not, he assumed I was like unscientific, like not using like rigorous methods or whatever. And he sort of like wrote me off, and he was talking to my friend afterwards, and she was like, no, Noah is not playing with crystals. That's not what he does. It's like, he's like writing in, like, he's got like publications and like research journals. I was like, yeah, I was like, okay. But it's like, I understand, like there's a lot of baggage on the word. Nietzsche says the cure for Plato is Thucydides. Put me back on track. There, that could do it. Yeah. Team Diogenes. Yeah. Team Diogenes, really. So, yeah. K-Par says, I think it's because the law of attraction, people that Oprah push call themselves metaphysicians. Yeah. Well, that's fair. The word gets abused. In philosophy, we understand what Aristotle's metaphysics is because that's what we call one of his books. Like the stuff in there. And then we have the distinction about the topics. It's just an area of discussion. Is that's what we call metaphysics. It's not a big deal. Now, if you want to call yourself a metaphysician and why you do that, the easiest way to do it, and I've actually had discussions with Luminous Bloom about this. It's like, look, you may not be a metaphysician like other people are, like hard metaphysicians saying like this is exactly what's an ontology or whatever. But again, you may be talking about the same things that they are and making distinctions in that area. Even if you don't agree with them, that puts you in that same like subject matter. So it's like, yeah, I actually do have metaphysical claims, but more generally, I'm just talking about that stuff a lot anyway. So It's like, yeah, why wouldn't I put myself with them? Systematics, as long as you don't claim to be a regular physician, you don't need a license. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Angie says, I think the New Age section of the half price of books has a sign that says metaphysics. Yep. Yeah, because they want to sound fancy and they use the word. Viper says, have there been many attempts to decouple our cognition from Darwinian utility? For example, are lofty words like truth just useful abstraction for monkey politics, or does it tend to get in the weeds too quickly? I mean, there's plenty of theories, like Vipers, like seriously. You could just take a pre-Darwinian theory. Kant is pre-Darwinian. So all the Kantian epistemology, and there's plenty of Kantian epistemologists, are going to not use a Darwinian utility at all. They just won't. It will be like these pre-Kantian things. And so there's actually, like if you want to get into it, there'll be lots of weeds, but there's plenty of non-Darwinian theories. Now, if you want to talk about hard science and like scientific stuff, no, then you're going to have to deal with the Darwinian stuff. But like there's plenty of philosophies that don't do it. Unreal says weird etymology, and Frank say physician means physicist, so it makes perfect sense for a person who studied metaphysics to be a metaphysician. However, English pulled the word physician to mean doctor, so metaphysician sounds like a meta-doctor. I do not like it. Yeah, so I mean, this is how things get fucked up. Words mean different stuff in different languages, and, shit happens. Okay, back to the paper. Deleuze avoids this objection, what we were talking about. Oh yeah, so how can Deleuze say he knows the power if knowledge is something the power gives you? So that would be like self-undermining. Mark Zuckerberg's doctor, sure. Deleuze avoids this objection by distinguishing knowledge from thought. Knowledge is a product of forces, but thought is the attempt to understand those forces. Remarking on Foucault's historical works, Deleuze says, quote, thought thinks its own history, the past, but in order to free itself from what it thinks, the present, and be able to finally to think otherwise, the future. End quote. The difference between thought and knowledge is that knowledge is a set of sedimented practices that devolve upon the relations of force, while thought is the subversion of that sedimentation through the process of articulating the relations, of force that constitute it. Thus, both thought and knowledge can offer us justified beliefs. Okay, so you've got like a reflection thing. You can be like, oh, okay, I learned this stuff, but I'm reflecting on it. We're calling that thought, and be like, well, there must be these forces, and then that's giving you a sort of self-justifying thing that you can reflect and get your own sort of source of power through your thoughts. Okay, thought, however, describes the source of those specific beliefs that we have called knowledge in non-epistemic terms, which, as we shall see, does not mean that the source lies outside of knowledge, and thus brings us a new set of beliefs that in turn will become sedimented and in need of new thought. All Cause Money says, so it's metaphor, yeah, cognition is metaphorical. Yes, Cos, but you have to take metaphors really seriously. So this is metaphor with like capital M, okay? So like, yeah, it's all metaphorical, but what else do you have besides your metaphors? You probably don't have much else. Like, none of us are like cognitive scientists, or maybe a few of us are, I don't know. But like, nobody, even the cognitive scientists, know how everything's working. So it all is going to come down to metaphors and like other sort of concepts. And so, yeah, it's all metaphor, but you have to take the metaphors really seriously because that's all we have. Zuck's doctor is Noonien Song's dumb nephew. No shit. And you want to know what? I'm from Dobbs Ferry. Zuckerberg's from Dobbs Ferry. I'm in Dobbs Ferry right now. Zuckerberg's house is about a mile, where he lived is about a mile that direction when he grew up. I did not know him. He's went to the next school district over from me. What this perspective entails and what has consequently become the core of Deleuze's project is the following. 1. That we seek the foundations of many of our beliefs not from within them, but from a perspective that puts them in doubt. And 2. That we must evaluate those beliefs not on the basis of whether they are true or false, but on the basis of whether or not they are life-affirming, or in the language of Anti-Oedipus, whether they're useful, whether they work. Regarding the a priori of any philosophy, then Deleuze would ask what forces constitute that a priori and how are we to evaluate those forces. Okay, yeah, so reflect on your shit and try to figure it out. Okay. Such a perspective questions the assumption that power is essentially suppressive. Deleuze, in his work with Guattari, offers a different kind of idea of the operation of power. At first, it might seem that the division made between desire and the social, in which desire is encrusted, is a return to the traditional anarchist paradigm. Quote, there is only desire in the social and nothing else, end quote. The appearance given by the statement is that desire, which Deleuze and Guattari valorize as a creative force, is opposed to the social, which limits and oppresses it as a suppressive power. Indeed, the description of the social as that which sees to it that desire is, quote, dammed up, channeled, regulated, unquote, and seeming valorization of deterritorialization against the social attempt at re-territorialization would reinforce such a reading. What's up, Energy? However, matters are not so simple. The key question for Deleuze and Guattari is how desire can come to desire's own repression, and to that question comes a reply, quote, the powers which crush desire or which subjugate it themselves already form part of the assemblages of desire, end quote. So we're doing it to ourselves. We like our BDSM like crushing us. Okay. It's already part of us. Thus, desire is implicated in its own oppression, and to speak of a benign essence standing opposed to a force that blocks or suppresses it is to substitute a hierarchic and strategic picture of the social field for a non-reductive and tactical one. Quote, desire is a mixture, a blend to such a degree that bureaucratic or fascist pieces are still or already caught up in revolutionary agitation, end quote. The question that motivates Anti-Oedipus is not how to free desire from its repression by the social, but rather how to decide which investments of desire are revolutionary and which are reactionary. This question, is known in chapter 6 below, is one of ethics, not essences, and in this sense, Foucault was precisely correct to call Anti-Oedipus a book of ethics. Viper says, not quite what I mean. I guess I'm asking if philosophers have investigated the fundamental concepts like truth, knowledge, which philosophy rests upon, are universal, almost like Platonic ideals, or just useful abstract tools for apes on a wet rock. I mean, Vipers, the only thing I can say is like, almost like Platonic ideals. That's how Plato did it. There's still Platonists around nowadays, or Neoplatonists at least. Like, yes, people do this. If you're asking specifically, have people tried to disentangulate Darwinian ideas after they came on the scene out? I would suspect that they have. But especially people like in, like, say, a Kantian tradition, in a Platonic tradition, they would, like, want to be clear what's a Platonic ideal versus a modern technological Darwinian concept. But, like, you said it yourself, there are other theories like Platonic stuff that probably would not, that, like, you might be able to make it work with Darwin, but then there's going to be people who want to disentangle it. I'm sure that's out there. Do I know it? No. But, like, you'd have to go look at Neoplatonic theories of knowledge. No, Energy, just chilling, doing the thing. It's been an okay week. It's been an okay week so far. Anti-Snowman says, so what's the whole society like at the superego? If superego is like the mean, strict schoolmaster in our head that goes, no, you must be a good boy and follow the rules. Well, this is saying it's some parts are you. Some of it's saying you kind of like some of it, and some of it you don't like. We are reading The Political Philosophy of Postructural Anarchism by Todd May, Chapter 4. This was requested. Yeah, so I can also give you a little link. So yeah, Anti-Snowman, they're saying, look, people are complicated. We like some of the structural things in our lives. You don't want complete freedom. That's a little bit scary. You already have, like, tendencies to lean towards certain forms of suppression or repression or power that you actually think are good or you enjoy for different reasons. And to be honest, like, you do like the things you like because they do have limitations. All the things you do have certain limitations on them. Like, so Koss was talking about he likes to DJ in VR chat, or has in the past. And you might say, well, you can be anything you want in VR chat. Well, no, you can't. You can be certain sorts of things. It's governed by the system. You can be different things in VR chat than you are in, like, IRL. Like, you can dress up. You can go be a furry IRL. You can go have a furry avatar in VR chat. You can do certain things like that, but it is not universal. And you might like certain restrictions more than others, and you will seek them out. You might like the virtualized environment that keeps you in your house, that you don't actually have to go out and meet people in like the real world, because that can be scary. So maybe that's why you like online, but that comes with its own restrictions. Yeah. Latvian says you might not be lucid of it either. It's caked into the way you have to interact with everything. Yeah, absolutely. And that's fundamental. That you may not realize it. You may like it and not know why, or lots of stuff. It may just be, as Latvian says, caked in. I'd say built in or whatever. But yeah, that's how it goes. Everybody says, correct me if I'm mistaken, however, my understanding post-structuralist is the idea that human nature is generally malleable and contingent with, which, if my understanding is correct, I agree with. I actually don't have enough background to make claims about all of post-structuralism. I don't know. People in chat probably know better than I do. Yeah. Yeah, I can't even give you an answer. I don't know. Again, there's multiple post-structuralists. I don't think it's that unified a group. So maybe some agree with you, some don't. I couldn't even tell you. Sorry. Like this is I'm reading something that is outside my usual knowledge base, so, or as they'd say, the usual base of like the institutional forces that make me think I have understood something about philosophy, and these people are trying to get outside that. So yeah. Okay, for Deleuze and Guattari, power does not suppress desire, rather is implicated in every assemblage of desire. Otherwise put, if a thing is constituted by the forces that take it up, those forces should be seen as immanent, not transcendent, to that which is appropriated by them. Yeah, so they're immanent means internal, and transcendent is, transcends, it goes outside. So it's already built into what you're doing. It's immanent. It's inside the structure of whatever it is you're doing. It's all already caked in, as was said. Here we have used interchangeably the concept of power and that of force. If power is interpreted as non-suppressive, then the distinction between the two in Deleuze's work becomes effaced. To say that there are forces of desire or forces that are life-affirming is the same as saying that there are desiring or life-affirming powers. Yeah, okay, just a definitional thing. Latvian says, may have the examples above about how there's revolutionary act that are conceived that nonetheless have bureaucratic tendencies. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, if you're going to like have a new form of government and it's revolutionary, there's still maybe bureaucracy in whatever new form you're going to do. I mean, if you're just going to make a new form of government and then just leave, have no form of like bureaucracy, well, okay, but something's going to take that space. Yeah. Okay, the picture here is of a network of forces or powers that interact to yield the world, especially the political world in which we live, or more accurately, which we are. Deleuze's abandonment of the traditional anarchist picture of the operation of power offers a new picture, both of politics and the social world, one that requires an analysis of each assemblage of desire on its own terms rather than a valorizing of one type of assemblage. Quote, still it is in concrete social fields at specific moments that the comparative movements of deterritorialization, the continuums of intensity, and the combinations of flux that they formed must be studied, end quote. In this sense, Deleuze is correct when he says, and this could have been said by Foucault or Lyotard with equal justice, quote, I have always felt that I am an empiricist, that is, a pluralist, end quote. Unreal says, the following is off the top of my head, but let me see what I can do. Definition, a couple of posts long. Okay, this will be. DeMarshall says, I think the term refers to their main enemy, Levi Strauss, and linguistic structuralists. Yeah. So what DeMarshall says, I think, is historically correct. Now, does that help you with what you said? I don't know. But, like, there was definitely structuralists and Levi Strauss and, like, theories that they were reacting against. So, yeah. Okay, and Unreal's trying to help us out with some definitions. Thank you, Unreal. Okay, before turning to the question of how far do we actually have to go? Because it's not that late. Did I miss anything? No, we got a while to go. I mean, it's a few pages. Okay, this is not killer. Yeah, this is what I thought. Not gonna kill me. Okay, before turning to the question of why the juridical or the suppressive assumption about power has dominated political thought, it is worth seeing how Foucault views power, for he both converges with and diverges from Deleuze in his analysis. His divergence is in approaching power empirically rather than metaphysically. This approach reflects not merely a difference in the level of analysis, but a substantial philosophical difference as well. Quote, all my analyses, end quote, he once said in an interview, quote, are against the idea of universal necessities in human existence, end quote. Whereas Deleuze tries to offer a metaphysical foundation for his political analyses, albeit one that supports a tactical political philosophy, Foucault thinks the best way to tactics is to avoid metaphysics altogether. In his work after the archaeology of knowledge, he does this fairly assiduously, although there remain brief times when he sounds more essentialist than he seems to want. Thus, Foucault tries to offer an analytics of power rather than a theory of power, because if one tries to erect a theory of power, one will always be obliged to view it as emerging at a given place and time, and hence to deduce it to reconstruct its genesis, end quote. Okay, so we got postmodernism is essentially from Unreal is essentially radical perspectivism. Postructuralism gets defined similar, but structuralism tends to be a real systematization of how symbols interact. That is a structure most not only so for post-structuralism, that would imply a lot more looseness, flexibility in how symbols refer to concepts and how they interact with each other. A free play of signs. Okay, thank you for the rundown, Unreal Brian. Yeah, so this is fair. If you're going to say, look, there's powers out in the world and you're trying to just give a theory of them, then you might actually have to figure out where they came from and reconstruct its genesis. If you're just going to be a pluralist about this, you're just looking at like what's out there, you don't have to worry about where it came from. You're just looking at what exists. That's the idea of a empiricist. You're just trying to figure out what the landscape looks like, not how it came to be. But like that's the whole thing. If you have a theory, then you're gonna have a source of like what's fundamental and what's going up. Funny is power. You'll have to say more, Vipers. How is funny power? Or is power funny? Or does power define funny? It might. Foucault offers an analytic of the operation of power in the modern period. His most sustained treatment of the general characteristics of that operation is in the first volume of his History of Sexuality, where he advances the 4 propositions on modern power. 1, that, quote, it is exercised from innumerable points in the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations. 2, that relations of power are not in a position of exteriority to other types of relationships. That 3, power comes from below. That is, there's no binary and all-encompassing opposition between rulers and ruled at the root of power relations and serving as a general matrix. And 4, that power relations are both intentional and non-subjective. Oh, it's your seduction technique. Good to know. Good to know. There's something very mean I could say as well. How's that working? How's your power working at that point? It's like, is that working on you at this point? Oh, dearie. These propositions form the basis of what could be called an anarchist view of power. Further, their historically bound character avoids the attempt to raise anarchism to the status of a theory for all times, thus reinforcing the recognition that political philosophy happens within and takes account of the context of its articulation. Moreover, though not metaphysically drawn, the contours of this analysis parallel Deleuze's analysis of force relations and thus form a basis for the convergence in political philosophy between them. Okay, so what it is you're looking at the ways things are around, and there's just like it's a complex relationship. And so this is the point, is that it's anarchist because there's no centralized version of power. It's just generated out of the way we relate to things, both between what is powerful and what is not, and how we like what's powerful and what is not in some sense. Anti-Stoneman says, what I took away from reading the Foucault biography was he really was going all out, rebelling against powers, even the powers of the rebels. Sneaky guy, but you respect it, sure. That last part, it's intentional but not subjective. Yeah, I mean, this is part of the difficulty here. It's like, well, what exactly is the objective intentional part? Energy says, I haven't read Works by Foucault, so I'm not certain about this. However, I've heard Foucault's significant idea that our understanding of truth is historically contingent based on the cultures we are born into, which makes sense. However, I don't know if one can draw reasonable prescriptive recommendations based on it. It gets complicated, energy. It gets very, very, very complicated. So what do you mean by reasonable prescriptive recommendations at that point? Foucault definitely has things to say about how society's set up. So it's like, yeah. Inseparable from this analytics of power is the idea insisted on both by Foucault and Deleuze that power does not merely suppress its subjects, it creates them as well. We will see in chapter 5 below Foucault's tracing on the creation of the psychological subject and the political significance of this creation. But in more general terms, if power is conceived as operating not upon its objects, but within them, not from above, but from below, not outside other relationships, but across them, this entails the power that is not a suppressive force, but a creative one, giving rise not only to that which must be resisted, but also, and more assiduously, to the forms resistance itself often takes. That is what makes specific political analysis necessary. If power creates its own resistance, then the liberation from specific forms of power must take account of the kind of resistance that is being engaged in on pain of repeating that which one is trying to escape. Yeah, so this is one of these, I guess, Hegelian ideas that the seed of the resistance is already within the original thought. And so if you are resisting the power and you think you're going to overcome it, well, then you've really not done that because you've really just sort of perpetuated the same thought process by having that resistance, which was already defined by the powers that be. Latvian says the point is to be grounded in the given context. To raise it to a theory of all would betray its anarchism. Yeah, that's fair. Henry says, I don't necessarily know if the contingency of knowledge means our political structure should be prescribed to be a certain way. However, I'd have to think about more to have a well thought out perspective. Well, it's what Latvian says. It is kind of an anarchist perspective here. So the idea that you're going to have some sort of political structure might be exactly what they don't want because it's anarchist. Anti-Someone says, is that kind of like saying the worst thing you can feel about a person isn't hate but apathy? Yeah. So again, if you hate someone, there might be a reason that you have something in common with them, and that's why you hate it. You're seeing something of yourself in them maybe, and that's why you don't like them, because it's reflecting poorly on yourself and you recognize that in some weird way. Apathy, on the other hand, is you just don't care. It's okay, something else is going on there and you have to figure out what. Emily says, what I find compelling from Foucault, not really a philosophical argument in the analytic sense, but he does a powerful job in portraying the isomorphism of various institutions, prison, hospital, military, barracks, schools, mental institution. Yeah. I mean, people say he's a shit historian, but his philosophy is not bad. You can see these structures across ideas, and that's what a sociologist or a philosopher does a lot of times. Auntie says, if I really hate peanuts, I'm playing into the big peanut companies. Yes, exactly. But I mean, it'd be one thing to say you hate peanuts. Another one to just be I don't enjoy them and then forget about it. If you actually hated Mr. Peanut and you were writing letters to Mr. Peanut and stuff, then yeah, you are engaging with the big peanut companies. Big Peanut is dominating your life. And they probably like that. Todd says, isn't more that the resistance to the power is inherent to the dynamic, not that it isn't doing anything. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I meant to say. I hope I didn't say otherwise. I was saying, if the resistance is already built into the theories of power or the structure of the power, then yeah, it's inherent there. It's not that it isn't doing anything. It's that if you continue with that form of resistance, then you're still dealing with the same power structure. Unreal says you're a slave to Big Nut. That sounds accurate. Viper says age test at midnight. Xmas Day is 2 weeks away. If your response was yay, you're still young. Yeah. Big Peanut at it again. K-Power says we make a paper trail of info that feeds advertise and big data to feed us info. Yeah, so that's our surveillance capitalism at the moment. K-Power is pointing out. So yeah, we are engaging with big data, the Googles, the Metas, Facebooks of the world, Apple, Netflix or whatever, what you watch, and then they feed you stuff that you like the algorithm on TikTok. You look at certain things and then they feed you more of it and you like that, but then they get more information from you. So it's a give and take. Yeah, I'd be getting anti-Semites. I'd be getting that Twitter interaction numbers going up with Mr. Peanut. Yep, exactly. Yeah, Twitter interaction, same thing. We are participants in power, but also resisting, says K-Pars. Absolutely. Doga says, somehow I make the best food. Watching your homemade cashew chicken stir fry. Oh, it sounds good. Sounds good. K-Par says of our own volition too. It's resistance to learn to make your own desires, but how can you create new desires? Cashews, not peanuts. Yes, I see your resistance there, Dojo. Yeah, and that's part of the doom scrolling at the moment, is that they keep feeding you fun things that you like, and it doesn't actually feel good over time because you're not creating yourself. You're just sort of like you're not passively, because you are like making choices. You're looking at stuff, but it's not. It's like the doom scroll is going to get you eventually. It's just you get the brain rot because, again, they are trying to advertise to you as well. They're trying to get you to react in certain ways. And so, yes, you're involved with them, but it's how do you create something new out of that? It's very difficult. 6-7. I don't even know what the 6-7 thing is. I haven't even. That's how much of a boomer I am. It's like I've seen people basically talking about it. I've never actually seen kids 6-7 or whatever it is they do. Goss says, apparently I couldn't convince your Kantian professor friend that all is matter and that originals don't have any meaning, such as a original Picasso versus a reprint. Oh, well, okay. I mean, were they just being stubborn? You may have been right. I don't know, Goss. I mean, Kantians I wouldn't assume to just go in for that sort of simulacra theory. 69, nice, dude. Okay, back to the paper. Therein lies the importance of the relation between power and knowledge. Foucault does not, as Deleuze does, try to ground knowledge metaphysically in power. However, his analyses of the specific relationships between the two make plain that much of what passes for crucial areas of knowledge in our culture is inseparable from relations of power, which that knowledge reinforces. Quote, there can be no possible exercise of power without a certain economy of discourse of truth, which operates through and on the basis of this association. End quote. In his 3 volumes on the history of sexuality, Foucault demonstrates that the knowledge one has of oneself as a sexual being is inseparable from the social order in which one finds oneself. For instance, the Greek knowledge of the human body as engaging finite and expandable forces and requiring a balance between excess and chastity was confluent with the practices of self-mastery and mastery of one's household, and ultimately of the state, practices that were partially determinative of Greek culture. In contrast, the practice of confession in the 16th and 17th centuries, evolving from a confession of deeds to a confession of who one was as a sexual being, became part of the movement towards a knowledge of the interior self that was to dominate the modern understanding of who we are. Laughing says, a different streamer I like has an assertion I think is true, quote, there is no mechanism upon which we can separate people and their actions from the conditions and circumstances that give rise to them, end quote, which is also in the style of remaining grounded in a word. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's people like analytic philosophy mostly, but philosophy in general quite often wants to make things outside of time, anachronistic. Like say things for all time, this is the way the world or metaphysics is universally. And that's very suspicious. Like, very suspicious. Most likely just wrong. Laughing says that bit about your knowledge as a sexual being is dependent on the social order sticks out as something Judith Butler ran with from Foucault. Yeah. I mean, the feminists tend to be situated in their epistemology. And so that besides being in a female body versus a male body and things like that, it also means time and place. And so that's definitely coming. It sounds like it's coming from a lot of this stuff. I don't know the history. I don't want to get it wrong, but it does sound like the situated epistemology is very related here. Okay. Summing up this difference in the relationship of sexual knowledge to conditions of power, Foucault wrote, quote, the Greek relation to truth was a structural, instrumental, and ontological condition for establishing the individual as a moderate subject leading a life of moderation. It was not an epistemological condition enabling the individual to recognize himself in his singularity as a desiring subject and to purify himself of the desire that was thus brought to light, end quote. In this description, epistemology is inseparable from politics, displaying Foucault's analysis as a property of power/knowledge, a political analysis of knowledge that, while not reducing knowledge to politics, makes clear its fusion with the network of political and social practices. Moreover, this fusion was not one of suppressing sexuality, but of determining and controlling it. Quote, a policing of sex that is not of the rigor of a taboo, but the necessity of regulating sex through its useful and public discourses. And you can hear this like sort of fusion and network of political. We're in like hyper internet sort of this here, whereas political and the network of political and social practices. Now we'd say like the internet version of this, whatever it is, the fusion with like the online discourse. Lavin says, Butler listing gender trouble is very, very fucko-y. I didn't expect such a strong influence. Okay. I mean, you'd have to look it up. There may be other people in this area that Butler is drawing from. I don't know. I don't know enough of the history about it, but it's possible that like this is where it's coming out of. Okay. Rocco said, I have 2 young boys and looked up 6'7". It's a meaningless phrase basically, but they know it can be used to trigger mechanisms, especially on adults. Okay. I mean, that's all I know about it, but I've never even seen it used. Like that's what I mean. I've only heard people talk about, I've never even seen it done by a kid. Like I just don't, I just don't know. Yeah. Energy says, my understanding, literary critic Edward Said was influenced by the idea of Foucault as well. To my understanding, Foucault and other people associated with post-structuralism influenced left-leaning politics because people on left likely focus on perceived oppression of groups on power. I mean, yeah, but like again, where the actual history lies. Like this is what I also suspect. Like I mean, general agreement with you, but that doesn't mean that history is correct. That's just my rationalist reconstruction of it, and it would be unfair and like sort of irresponsible for me to just assume so. I don't want to do that. Yeah. Douglas says 67 is the age they're planning to throw us into the volcanoes. Oh, no, definitely not, Dojo. They want us to work a lot longer than that. They're not going to throw us into the volcanoes till at least like 75, 80. Laffy says you probably find like a dozen ENS Paris philosophy department people citing gender trouble. Yeah. So, do I know enough about that stuff to talk about it? No. But it's like, yeah, stuff. But the general point in this area is that, like, look, the way you're going to understand yourself is going to be related to both the politics that you grew up with and also like the social network. And what we would have would be a techno-social practices network, a techno-social network at this point. And that would include online groups and algorithms and stuff like that. And that makes sense because you're going to relate to the things you find sexy online, and that's going to inform you what you think what is sexy. Because they're going to show you certain things. You're going to like some of it, not all of it, but what they're showing you is going to also affect how you see yourself and what you think is sexy. Okay, you got it. Talking about stuffs. Okay. Given then the post-structuralist approach to power, its difference from the anarchist a priori assumption of the suppressive nature of power, and its view that knowledge and power are often, if not always, intertwined, it is not surprising that it would see a political significance in the assumption that power is suppressive or juridical. That significance has not been given much attention, but the focus is more on offering an analytics or a theory of the positivity and local efficacy of power. But Foucault offers a suggestion, quote, power is tolerable only on the condition that it masks a substantial part of itself. Its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms, end quote. Okay, well, you guys be nice. Okay. Foucault goes on to suggest that the juridical notion of power became encrusted from the Middle Ages on as institutions like the state were able to implant themselves by defining their power in terms of regulation and limitation, that is, in terms of law. Further, as opposition to the policies of the state and its allied institutions arose, the attempt to wrest power from improper regulation continued to define power as proper regulation. Thus, power, even when constraining, remains articulated in terms of restraint. Quote, in political thought and analysis, we have not cut off the head of the king, end quote. That failure has allowed power to operate in the ways it does without detection. I know that I'm speaking English, however, the words are not processing. Bullshit in the nicest sense. Okay. Basically, this is just saying, look, power is sneaky because in wrapping itself up with epistemology, you don't realize it's power. Okay? That's all that's happening in here. By saying, look, what you think you know is also involved in like power structures, like in like the government. Power is masquerading as knowledge, and in masquerading as knowledge, you don't see it as power structures. You're just seeing it as things you know or things like you like are capable of doing, and so you don't realize you're playing into power structures. And that's all this is. Yeah. Okay. Continuing, it would be a mistake here to interpret Foucault as claiming that power intends to mask itself in order to avoid discovery. It's not doing it on purpose, yeah. Such an interpretation ascribes too much intentionality to power, though such an ascription is sometimes Foucault's as well. Rather, it should be taken to mean that had power been thought to operate in the ways in which it does indeed operate, at least in the modern epoch, more fruitful political resistance would have been more likely. The point, if in some sense, is in some sense teleological. It's Darwinian rather than Aristotelian. We can explain the success of so many operations of power by the fact that they were not discovered owing to a misapprehension about power. This does not imply, however, that power wanted us to have this misapprehension. Yeah, so again, this is all word salad as far as I can tell. Basically, it says you think you just know stuff, but really in knowing it, you're not realizing that it's power structures that tell you you know it, and then you have just ran with that stuff, and that's it. I'm watching you, weed industry, yeah. It's highly specific determinism. Yes, that's true. What Viper says. Okay. You're just being controlled through a different method, and the method that power is using is controlling you, determining your life by telling you what's true and what's false. And you believe that it is true and false, and you think you know this. Okay, that the anarchist a priori regarding power is convergent with the 19th century's general conception of the nature of power can be explained then as a politically significant failure that bars anarchism from completing the journey down the tactical path along which it traveled. That this failure persists into the 20th century is also not a cause for surprise, since our political theoretical landscape is still dominated by the suppressive assumption about power. Moreover, it is dominated by an assumption that has been seen forms the other, if at times abated, half of anarchism's a priori. Humanist naturalism, the concept of a benign human essence. If post-structuralist political thought could be summed up in a single prescription, it would be that radical political theory, if it is to achieve anything, must abandon humanism in all its forms. Cost, I don't know what this is solving or what it's addressing anarchism in post-structuralism. I mean, that's just basically what's going on generally. But this is only chapter 4 of the book. I don't know exactly what the overall arc of this is. Like, I was asked to read this. This is chapter 4. I didn't read the introduction, chapter 1, 2, or 3, and I'm not going to read any more than this either. So I wish I could tell you. Yeah, it's a book. Anti-Snowman says, in his biography, a way Foucault can be seen as applying this idea of power wearing a mask, and that's what makes it tolerable. Foucault was described as by a friend as having 1,000 different masks. Could be a coincidence, though, obviously. Yeah. So, but that's the idea, is like the way you talk about the world, the way you think about the world can also, it reflects what like a hierarchy you put in the world. And so, if like Foucault's also doing this himself, the things he talks about, the things he like emphasizes at different times, changes the hierarchy of like what's important, then like, yeah, he's manipulating power structures by calling different things true and false at different times. Doris says, don't assume that your enemy is like you. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's part of the issue, is people underestimate their enemies. They underestimate other people. They underestimate themselves. Things are very different out there. And, a lot of political and international things go wrong because you don't understand where other people are coming from. So, not necessarily enemies. Sometimes your friends aren't even like you. That's a good thing. Okay, let's see, how much farther do I have to get? Because this is not easy reading for me. This is like a lot of big words that I'm not used to reading. I feel like we're doing okay. Maybe not. A few more pages, yeah. All right, hopefully I can go quick. All right, not terrible, not terrible. But there's a lot of discussion about this, so I'm not going very fast either. All right, the post-structuralist reaction against the idea of a benign human essence, or for that matter, any human essence at all, a position that we shall, following post-structuralists, call humanism, is rooted in the history of French thought in the post-war era. Humanism returned to French philosophy in the works of existentialists, particularly Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. It was combined with the phenomenological thought of Husserl and what there was of phenomenology in Heidegger to give priority of place to the perceiving and acting subject. The driving thought behind the appropriation of phenomenology by the existentialist is the Kantian one that the world cannot be apprehended except through the facilities of the perceiving subject, whether that subject be empirical or transcendental. Such a subject possesses three key characteristics that mutually imply one another: a consciousness transparent to itself, voluntary self-determination, and to a greater or lesser degree, the constitution of its own experience. In Sartre's early works, especially Being and Nothingness, the idea of primacy of the subject issues in a philosophy of radical freedom, wherein the subject's essence is to be a nothingness, a pure appropriation of a world that, in order to hide its own nothingness from itself, it tries to model itself after. This nothingness, then, is a freedom from all determination by the world, what Sartre calls bad faith. It is precisely the attempt to escape the burden of freedom by taking on the concrete determinations of being that characterize the world. Okay, this is all history stuffs. Doga says, I think that is why the prescription is to abandon humanism. My daughter just listened to a video about Alex Murdaugh, the guy that murdered his wife and son in South Carolina. Oh, yeah, I heard about that. Assumptions about your position in the world and about the people who are a different level of power is dangerous. Yeah. Okay. Merleau-Ponty's existentialism is more measured than Sartre's, admitting the possibility of the subject being determined both by the unconscious structure of the bodily behavior and by social institutions in which it is encrusted. The latter type of determination is conceded by Sartre after his turn towards Marxism. Nevertheless, his last writings, most notably The Visible and the Invisible, Merleau-Ponty's philosophical approach continues to be through subjective experience in its interaction with the world. The humanism of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy is an important factor in his break with Sartre. What offends him in Sartre's defense of communism, and in particular his valorization of the party, is its denial of the role of subjectivity as a necessary constituent in the Marxist dialectic. As the atrocities of World War II and its aftermath, some committed with great enthusiasm, became increasingly evident, doubt was cast upon the faith that both Sartre and Merleau-Ponty placed in the subject, a doubt shared not least of all by themselves. The rise of structuralism can be read in part as a reaction to the primacy existentialism places on the subject. The anthropological works of Claude Lévi-Strauss, the psychoanalytic texts of Jacques Lacan, the structural psychology of Jean Piaget, and the Marxism of Louis Althusser, don't know how to say Althusser, maybe that's right, with its rejection of Marx's early humanism, share a common conception of the subject as produced rather than producing, as an effect rather than a cause. Whether the determination of the subject is through structures of myth and kinship, the unconscious, the cognitive structures of the mind, or the political and especially economic structures of society, the theme is the same. Humanism as a philosophical project is fundamentally misplaced in seeking the constitution of the subject in a subjective essence. The constitution of the subject comes from outside its own realm of reflection and decision, thus undermining at a stroke the subject's transparency, voluntarism, and self-constitution. Althusser. Okay, Althusser. A lot of name dropping in that paragraph. I wish there were more examples than statements. Yeah, so this is a very fast run through history here. Again, this is a book. Maybe this got covered in a different section. I don't know. But yeah, this is just a fast run through and, a particular version of history here. Post-structuralism retained the structuralist dismissal of the subject in its philosophy. In the foreword to the English language edition of The Order of Things, Foucault writes, quote, "If there is one approach I do reject, however, it is that, one might call it broadly speaking, the phenomenological approach, which gives absolute priority to the observing subject, which attributes a constituent role to an act, which places in its own point of view the origin of all historicity, which in short leads to a transcendental consciousness." End quote. Deleuze calls the philosophical tradition that leads from Hegel through Husserl to Heidegger, quote, "a scholasticism worse than that of the Middle Ages," end quote. Lyotard's first published study, Phenomenology, shows how phenomenology's attempt to articulate a pre-predictive subjective experience, an experience not encrusted in material reality, particularly the materiality of history, is self-defeating. Quote, "In locating the source of meaning in the interstices between the objective and subjective, phenomenology has now realized that the objective and not the existential already contains the subjective as negation and overcoming, and that matter itself is meaning." End quote. Laffin says, "Not really. This book more broadly is a pulling together of thinkers. The book is where he fleshes out his arguments. More is twice as long and a decade later, but he does conclude the chapter with a synthesis." Okay, good to know. Thank you. All right, continuing. However, while continuing to jettison the subject as a relevant source of its own constitution or action, post-structuralism also casts doubt upon the structuralist resort to unitary structures outside the subject as an account of its determination. Yeah, so I mean, this is all to say, look, we are governed by social or political forces. Blah, blah, blah. All the rest of it doesn't matter. It's that the existential is like relying on the individual self is mistaken. There's stuff outside the world that determines how we exist. Someone says, is it sort of like this? After looking at the horrors of World War II, the post-structuralists were looking to get away from the monstrosity of humans are capable of when they think we were developed to be totally free of ourselves, like a morality without God. I'm getting tired. I'm way off. No, that's right. That's, I think, part of the story here. This also happened after World War I, and people who were seeing what was coming in World War II. This happened in analytic philosophy as well. I think Carnap in the 30s was also on this line, was trying to get away from the humanism or the people like being fundamental and saying, well, there's things in the world, because they didn't like what people do to each other. They saw the horrors of World War I. They saw other things coming down the pipeline, and they were like, this is bad. And so they were looking for more of an empirical understanding of what's going on, something in the world that they could draw on for explaining what's going on, and they didn't want it just to be like human freedom, and that was bad. So that's part of this stuff, is the social started to force its way into the theory. Okay. Because they didn't want it just to be relying on the individual people, because people suck. All right, continuing. As has been seen, rather than subsuming the subject under the structure of structuralism does, because again, structuralism, big structures, outside the people, it's not just the person. Snowman says, gotcha, that's really interesting. Is a morality that I've often seen post-structuralism accused of not valuing. Levine says, yep, you're on the right path. Human rights imply non-humans without rights, and that logic does lead us to genocide. Foucault talks about who's allowed to die. Yep. Actually, says, I don't know much about the idea of Sartre. However, I'm reading the writings of Ponty and interpret his writings related to the intersubjectivity is compatible with the interpretation that's often influenced by social communities. Yeah, and that was mentioned here briefly, that he was also aware of this, but he definitely, Merleau-Ponty definitely had a very first-person perspective that was important to his philosophy. Okay. All right. As has been seen, rather than subsuming the subject under the structure, as structuralism does, inverting the existential phenomenological subsumption of structure under subject, post-structuralism dissolves the subject-structure dichotomy altogether by substituting for both a concept that might be called practices. What is of interest to the post-structuralist is neither the constituting interiority of the subject nor the constituting exteriority of the structures, but instead the interlocking network of contingent practices that both produces both subjects and structures. Whether these practices are founded upon a metaphysics of forces, as is the case with Deleuze and Lyotard in the 70s, or rejects metaphysical grounding, as do Foucault and more recent Lyotardian writings, they remain a multiple, diverse, and contingent network of events, effects, and influences that define such dichotomies as above, below, and inside out. Subjects and structures are sedimentations of practices whose sources cannot be discovered in a privileged ontological domain, but that must be sought rather among the specific practices in which they arise. Foucault's rejection of humanism is explicit in his remarks about his work. Quote, "My objective has been to create a history of the different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subjects." End quote. Although his early works have more in common with structuralism than he was wont to admit, by the time of Discipline and Punish, he abandons the idea of grand strategic social formations, archaeology for the study of small practices that give rise to the taken for granted realities of our culture or genealogy. In both periods, though, Foucault is concerned to show that the subject is not a source of its own essence, which implies that the subject has no essence, as the concept is traditionally conceived. This is the idea behind his remark at the end of The Order of Things, that as epistemic structures shift, quote, "man would be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea," end quote. Tears and rain at that point. It is even more evident in his works on the prison and sexuality, which show how some of the central themes through which we understand our subjectivity are products of practices that have as much to do with politics as with knowledge. Quote, "It would be wrong to say that the soul is an illusion or an ideological effect. On the contrary, it exists, it has reality, is produced permanently around, on within the body, and by the functioning of a power that is exercised on those punished, and in a more general way, on those one supervises, trains, and corrects over madmen, children at home and at school, the colonized over those that are stuck at a machine and supervised for the rest of their lives. This is the historical reality of the soul." End quote. And what's fun about this is I'm a little like my back hurts here from sitting reading this for so long. And I'm like, they're talking about those stuck at a machine right here. Streamers feel this. You are stuck by the stream. Like that's what happened. Never seen a soul? What's up, Globus? How you been? Well, this is the point. It's defined for you by the power structures. That's what's going on. You don't see it, but it exists because it's defined by those that want to control whatever it is they call your soul. The power structure of broadcasting, yeah. I always keep in mind, this is an Amazon product, Twitch is. If you guys don't know our good buddy Globus the Elder, please go give Globus the Elder a follow. Globus does AI news and analysis, and lots of smart discussion, smart people over there. So if you want more smart discussion and like some fun talk about new tech, it's like good times. Globus, I doubt you were here, but like 2 hours ago now, I got an email from an AI company that had a custom AI built to try to generate leads on academic articles. So they had found one of the papers I published, ran it through their AI, and was trying to generate academic sort of like insights and leads and like references that might be used to do more research. I thought it was interesting. It was okay, like what it was doing, but it was like a custom AI. I was like, and they say all their references are always like real in that AI. I was like, cool stuff. Viper says the invisible and the non-existent look very much alike. Yes, that's right. But I mean, this is the point, is that why is anyone telling you have a soul, something you can't see? And that's the whole point, is that you've been told this everyone here has heard the word. They know what that means. And it's like, you've been told this. And so it's like, there's something going on there. And this is attempting to explain why we've all been told about souls and things like that. It's because basically there's power structures that define these things, and then they tell you have it, and then you supposedly know what it is, and you know something about it, but in knowing that, you're playing into those power structures. For Foucault, the subject is constituted rather than constituting. I can't speak anymore. Subject is constituted rather than constituting. It's created. The subject is created rather than making up the thing. This does not, however, mean that people are determined. The subject as such is a historical construction that emerged from practices that were both political and epistemological. We think of ourselves as subjects, we act as subjects, and in that sense we are subjects. Quote, it exists, it has reality, end quote. But subjectivity, quote, there are two meanings of the word subject: subject to someone else by control and dependence, and tied to his own identity by conscience or self-knowledge, end quote. Since it is a historical phenomenon, dependent upon the practices from which it emerged and which sustain it, can be altered or abolished by new practices. These practices cannot emanate from a subject as an act of subjective will, but they can come from people inserting their actions into the contingent web of historical events and institutions. The constitution of the subject is not the exhaustive determination of behavior, although inasmuch as it is appropriated as a mode of self-knowledge and thus as a mode of living, subjectivity will define parameters of our options, our powers, and the normal and acceptable range of behavior. Energy says, to my understanding, there are some biologists like Levin who believe consciousness is immaterial, so I wouldn't say it is completely socially constructed if there are respectable scientists who believe in it, unless I'm misinterpreting the papers criticizing the idea of an immaterial soul. Well, Energy, I don't have a whole lot to say about scientists who talk about immaterial things outside of their science. Like, that's the... Like, if you're going to do science and you start talking about an immaterial soul, you have gone into metaphysics, and then you're in the realm of philosophy. And so they may be respectable scientists, but that statement that they made is not a scientific statement. Now, they could say the limits of what their science can do, but, you know, you are outside of science if you're talking about immaterial souls. And so it's like, I'm not telling the guy to stay in his lane. I'm just saying he's gone into philosophy and he's a philosopher at that point. So if you're calling him a scientist, well, he ain't doing science right then. Yeah. Viper says, I wonder if there's a measurable demarcation in ideas that seem deep pre-information age versus same ideas that seem mundane and quotidian in the information age. Good question. I don't know. I'm too far gone at this point to give a well thought out answer to that question, Vipers. There's always been shitty philosophy, and it's always been a pain in the ass to go, like, figure out what the good stuff is versus the bad stuff. It would look very different, and it's going to be contextual, too, because, you know, they use different terms, and, like, the science was different, a lot of stuff was different, so it'll be really hard to be, like, measurable demarcation, because the language is just going to be different too. You have to sit there and figure out what they meant. Because sometimes some stuff in the history of philosophy looks really stupid until you figure it out, and then they're like, oh, that's not crazy. We just say it very differently now. Viper says scientists are also susceptible to cultural programming. Give me a boy 7, I'll give you the man and all that. Yeah, yep. Okay. Deleuze's positing of forces subtending the objects. I don't even know what subtending means here. I don't know what it means in general. I definitely don't know what it means here. Forces subtending the objects of experience already subverts any commitment to the idea of self-determining subject. What Deleuze rejects is both the self-mastery and the unity that the idea of subjectivity implies. Regarding self-mastery, Deleuze emphasizes throughout his writings the role of one sort of unconscious or another in determining both action and self-consciousness. Thus, quote, to remind consciousness of its necessary modesty is to take it for what it is, a symptom, nothing but the symptom of a deeper transformation of activities of entirely non-spiritual forces, end quote. These unconscious forces, moreover, form a diversity rather than a unity. In dialogues, Deleuze claims that individuals and groups are the intersection and development of three kinds of lines. 1, segmentary lines like those of a person's life cycle, family, school, army, job, retirement. 2, molecular lines, which are the invisible forces coming from disparate directions in the social field and acting more subtly than the molar segmentary lines. And 3, lines of flight, which are other molecular lines we draw to escape our determinations by the specific molar and molecular lines that constitute us. Okay, This is all a lot of big words there, but basically you can break it down to like things that control us and things that we escape from, and the ones that are just kind of the scenery. It's like, yeah, what was the line from Ronin? You're either part of the solution, part of the problem, or part of the scenery. That's what was going on here. We should blame Shan for the information age. Canadians. Laughing Jesus says, this section analyzing the historical subject is part of the setup for May's conclusion about humanism. The next few paragraphs I find are him trying to lay bare more bluntly than the author themselves have done. Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. You're a big scenery guy, Anti-Snowman? Yeah. Viper says, yeah, but our horizons are wide simply because we have more access to ideas. Pre-internet collating information to form a novel idea took a lot more effort, so surely the bar has been raised. Yeah, but that's also the problem, is we have a lot more information overload, Vipers. Like, you might be right, but I also get the sense that we're just bombarded with so much information that we may not actually have a good way of collating and sorting information. So I don't know if things are easier now or harder now. Like, that's just my initial reaction. Again, you probably have a point, but like, there's going to be another side to that. Like, we've got so much trash out there that getting to any good stuff might be harder, whereas back in the day only the good stuff lasted, so you'd have like a survivorship bias. I don't know. Yeah, philosophy and jargon, sigh. Yeah, what are you gonna do? I mean, everyone has their jargon, and only in retrospect, after we've like figured it out, does it really become a lot better. Our buddy Aris always gripes and harps on this. He says, look, part of the job of philosophy is explaining stuff, and if you don't say stuff clearly, that's on you. And that's fair. But I also sometimes, like, I put so much fucking time and effort into things, and it's like I figured out this one way. It's all I got. And so I like, if some people understand it, good, and like, but that's all I got for now. And it's hard. And people accept continuous phrasing. Yeah, absolutely, K-Pars. So that's the difficulty, is that if you're bringing the goods, people will slog through it, but you better bring the goods. Otherwise, you might as well just say what you're saying plainly, because if you're not bringing the goods, ain't no one got time for that shit. Like, this molar and molecular lines, come on. What the fuck does that mean? All of these lines, including the last, act upon us without our conscious consent most of the time. Moreover, they determine what will count as consciousness at all. They are the forces of which consciousness is the symptom. They are the parts that determine the whole, which is not a unity, but merely a part alongside the others. Quote, we no longer believe in the myth of existence of fragments that, like pieces of an antique statue, are merely waiting for the last one to be turned up so that they may all be glued back together to create a unity that is precisely the same as the original unity. We believe only in totalities that are peripheral, end quote. Furthermore, at least one of the wholes that we have been told we are, the Oedipal subject, is not the basis for a project of political freedom, but, as Anti-Oedipus tries to show, a continuation of oppression. Anti-Snowman says, communication is hard, yeah. I just try to use humor and metaphor to get through to other humans most of the time. Well, that's what I was saying also to It All Costs Money earlier, is that you have to take the metaphors really seriously in philosophy and other places. But like that, a lot more of what we say we think is like objective, but a lot of it's metaphor. A lot of it is. So it's like, is it all metaphor? The answer is always going to be yes. It's always all metaphor. We just call some metaphors more objective than others. Okay. Yeah, so yeah, you're in Platonic space. You're a philosopher. Okay. Yeah, okay, so Dojo knows something about Levin. Okie dokie. We'll see. Laughing says we are shaped and also shaped the way we're getting shaped. Yeah, it's an interactive, like, back and forth. There should be an easier way of saying this, but like, yeah. It's like, it's not conscious, but we push back on it. Sure, all these things. This subversion of the primacy of consciousness is also a subversion of the notion of subjectivity, since subjectivity is a concept that implies the ability of a person consciously to recognize and control the forces within him or her. Deleuze's subversion, though different from Foucault's in being metaphysical as well as historical, nevertheless strikes at the heart of any humanist project as the articulation of a subjectivity with an essence that can be both consciously grasped and voluntarily expressed or fulfilled. For Foucault, what has been called our essence is a political project that is oppressive rather than liberating, and even here we must not understand the notion of liberation as the freeing of an essential nature that has been socially bound. For Deleuze, the essence of subjectivity does not belong to it, rather it comes from multiple and various sites. It cannot be lived or fulfilled, and in the form of Oedipal subject, it is harmful rather than helpful to political transformation. Yeah, so I see what you mean by summarizing everyone else in this sort of version of how do we understand the interrelation of ourselves if we are not taking anything to be essential here. We have given up the essentialness, the essentiality. We are now just looking at particularities and how we are defining things in ourselves as given by social structures and pushed back by whatever sort of reflection we make for ourselves. I've been getting to the idea that mind at large recently, where the purpose of the brain isn't to create reality, but to filter it. To full disclosure, I like drugs. Yeah. It's not going to do, like, it's going to even be weirder than that, whatever it is. Whatever it is, it's going to be even weirder than that. It's not going to be a mere filter. It's not going to be creating reality. It's going to be one of these shifting, interactive things that is doing something. I don't even know what. Lavian says, yeah, non-essentialism is core, and that's why it grafts onto anarchism. Well, yeah. Makes sense. All right, let's see how much farther I got, because my voice is starting to get scratchy. Yeah, like a few pages still. Okay, I knew it was long, but I also not terrible. Jean-Francois Lyotard, whose philosophy has undergone a transformation from sharing with Deleuze a metaphysical orientation to a concern with language that is more Foucauldian in its empirical approach, outstrips both of his colleagues on the issue of humanism by constructing philosophies that leave the subject out of account altogether. Lyotard has never shown a preoccupation with humanism to subvert it. He has sought consistently for an approach to political philosophy that articulates relationships of power as well as modes of resistance as anonymous and impersonal, inhering in practices that cannot be reduced to, nor need address deeply the subjective or the structural. Lyotard criticizes Deleuze and Guattari's anti-Oedipus precisely for feeling the need to invoke Oedipus as an account of the formation of the modern subject. Quote, Deleuze and Guattari must be supported against themselves. Capitalism is indeed an orphanage, a celibacy submitted to the rule of equivalence. What supports it is not the configuration of the great castrator, but that of equality. Equality in the sense of communability of men in one place and of places for one man, of men and women, object, space, organs. Repression never stops becoming more exteriorized. End quote. Someone says, so Foucault was like, let's be free of what you can claim to be our essence and know there's not another essence we're replacing it. Yeah. Well, Foucault's definitely not going to attempt to replace essence, but you're still going to take on things from external forces in the world. They're going to make some sort of proposition about you that you're going to take on for yourself because you kind of like it for whatever reason. And that it might not give you an essence, but like they're going to be saying things about whatever it is you are. So you have to be wary is almost what I feel like the lesson is there. Because it's like it's an inevitability in this sort of setup. All right, this criticism does not mean that Lyotard in his works of the early and mid-1970s abandons the Deleuzian Nietzschean framework altogether. His major work of that time, Economy Libidinale, borrows the theme or idea of constitution by forces and recasting desire as libido, tries to offer an account of the workings of capitalism and of representation without recourse either to the subjective or the structural. For Lyotard, libido is an anonymous energy that both constitutes that which is oppressive and offers an alternative to it. Libido differs from Deleuze and Guattari's concept of desire, though, in being not only productive but destructive as well, and in the same gesture that it is productive. Quote, every intensity, brilliant or distant, is always this and not this, and not at all by the effect of castration, repression, ambivalence or the tragedy of the great zero, but by that which the intensity is the aesthetic, I can't even read anymore. Asynthetic movement, end quote. Lyotard's concept of libido is modeled on Freud's notion of life and death instincts, except for Lyotard, the two are not separate instincts, but part of the same anonymous force. So we get a mask always, Anti-Snowman. Leffing says, or you may hate it, I fucking despise the commodity from and its ramifications on all of us, but I still buy food. Yeah, but I mean, you've got a lot of concepts wrapped up in the idea of food. Food is definitely not without its own baggage. So it's like, yeah, but where is that? Like the food itself that you have to eat is one thing. The ideas of food in our society is another one. So it's like, I know you know this, but like it's not. Nothing ain't that simple. It never is. Laughing says, I have to take on the modes of relation capitalism demands of whether I like it or not, whether I'm loose or not. Yeah, exactly. Energy, I don't know exactly. I suspect it's more complicated what Lyotard is saying about libido. I just don't know. I've not read Lyotard. It seems like it's this, I mean, you may have written that before I got to it, but it seems like, this line right here, Lyotard's concept of libido is modeled on Freud's notion of life and death instincts. So it's definitely something, it ain't so simple, whatever it is. Okay, so Doug is referring to something Energy said. Okay. Two aspects of this concept of libido are crucial for understanding Lyotard's rejection of humanism. Okay, so we're getting into it a little bit. Energy. First, as in Freud, the libido is a constitutive rather than a constituted force. Moreover, in its anonymity and its irreducibility to its own constructs, the constructs of the libido are always a this and not, or a not this, never a this and not this. It ceaselessly escapes the grasp of the subject it determines. It is thus always beyond representation, although it is at the same time the source of all representation. It cannot be represented by the subject in an act of transparent self-consciousness, even though the subject is a libidinous effect. Second, for Lyotard, the very idea of representation is problematic. The attempt to reduce experience to representation is a project to be overcome, not completed. Representation is a species of the more general practice of theatrics, which Lyotard much criticized during the time of economy libidinal for its stultifying effect upon the libido through its introduction of the negativity of absence, distinguishable from death, which can be a positive destruction or auto-destruction. Lyotard's critique of Freud's attempt to adapt libido to a representational schema is exemplary of his view. Quote, it is clear that for Freud, the role of film is something like a work of art because it is a sign, because it replaces something, the mother for someone, a child. But for the student of libidinal economy, this function of the image or sign is not pertinent because it presupposes what one must try to produce by the theoretical argument, negativity. To say that the child acts out in his suffering the pain caused by his mother's absence is to take suddenly as given all the components of the theatrical space. In short, one gives in to the demands of the other of representation, which is secondary, without allowing oneself to be concerned at all with the principle that one had oneself so cleverly established. If it is indeed true that the primary process know no negation, then in the economy of drives there is not, nor can there ever be, an absence of the mother. Yeah, so, end quote. I get the point here. It's that you need a lot of moving parts to have these sorts of relationships. And Lyotard's saying that's crazy that we've got all these moving parts. Like it's a theater. You've got different players. You got the kid and the mother and the play between the two. But if you're just talking about the drives of the kid, well, that play doesn't exist. That has to do with whatever is affecting the kid in the sort of moment. What's up, Adam? How you doing? All right, the problem with representation is that it freezes the libido into a structure that is not dominated, that is dominated not by the libido's positivity, but by the negativity of an absent object. Yeah, so you've got this character off stage in the theater here. A representation is always a stand-in for something else that is not there, and is the absent object that dominates the discourse of representation. Representation, in attempting to capture the libido conceptually, instead betrays it, and in two ways. First, by pretending to be capable to be capable of accounting for it, although representation is only one of its effects. Second, by introducing negativity or absence into that account, which is not the essence of libido, but only of libido in its representational form. Lyotard's critique of representation, as well as his account of the libidinal economy, is profoundly anti-humanist. It is precisely by a gesture of self-representation that the subject is able to understand himself or herself, and although that self-representation is, by its transparency, supposed to offer an immediate access by the self to its own consciousness, the very act of representation presupposes a difference between the representer and the represented that introduces absence into the representation. Here one can sense the Derridian influence on Lyotard's thought. Thus, the project of a subject's grasping its own essence is necessarily a distorting one. The libidinous essence of the subject cannot be grasped by it and is misrepresented in the subjective attempt to grasp it. Anti-Snowman said, way too dank. This Lyotard stuff lost on me, but that's okay. This is not a crazy thought. Basically, any concept you use to understand yourself is going to be limited. You can't understand the like totality of a human. It's like, this is what great literature attempts to do. So you're attempting to understand yourself, and we are more than like our concepts at any one time. And that's basically all it is. That in making a representation, we have limited ourselves to whatever we were thinking at that moment, and that's never going to be sufficient to like fully understand yourself or another person. You may understand something about someone or something about yourself at any one time, but that's not going to be universal. Energy doesn't know much about Derrida. However, to my understanding, his ideas emphasize language more than other post-structuralists who emphasize biopolitics. Could be. I don't know enough about this area either to give an accurate relation of Derrida to other post-structuralists. Or even to say if Derrida is a post-structuralist. I don't even know. Okay. Any political intervention, if it is to be successful, must discard all projects, including the subjectivist one of comprehending and realize one's essence, that work through representation. Instead, such intervention must embark upon a program of subverting pretensions to completeness of the representational structure. It must open up other possibilities for action that cannot be reduced to representation and its negativity, but that instead allow for non-representational realizations of the libidinous. Since all political action involves representation, this will necessarily be a paradoxical project. For Lyotard, the goal is to subvert representation by exhausting its resources, by bringing it to the limit. Like, highway to the danger zone. Yeah, so we gotta like push it to the limit and get something new out of it. An example, Lyotard cites Klossowski's discussion of the multiplication of gods in pagan religion that so offended Augustine. Quote, for each connection, a divine name; for each cry, intensity; a connection that encounters both expected and unexpected, a small god, a small goddess, which is a name for the passage of emotions. Thus, every encounter gives rise to a divinity, all connections to an inundation of affects. End quote. The subversion of representation is by means of a multiplication rather than a diminution of representing entities, for a multiplication that drives the representational system to its own point of explosion. For Lyotard, it is the same with capitalism. The anarchy of the system should be pushed to and ultimately beyond its limits. One does not destroy capitalism by criticism, but by bringing its own principle to the limit where it bursts. I feel like that's the accelerationist line where everything's just getting terrible nowadays. Exactly. Highway to the danger zone. Yeah, and this is why, like, this is my cringe at, like, the accelerationists that, like, you're gonna die, and that's acceptable in my theory because, like, I have lots of money and I'll be okay. It's like, fuck off. But, like, what's gonna bring down capitalism eventually? I don't know. Maybe it won't. But, like, it won't come down. But still, it's, the idea that, like, just push it beyond its limits, like, well, that's dangerous. Gonna die. In the later 1970s, Lyotard moved away from the libidinal model, calling it too metaphysical. The problem with positing a libido at the base of all experience is that it repeats the same problem for which he had criticized representation. Since the libido is outside all representation, all discussion of it involves reference to an absence that dominates the discourse. Libidinal economy does not resolve the problem of negativity, it only reawakens it in a new form. Instead of the libido, Lyotard directs his concern primarily to language, which had been a more implicit preoccupation during the critique of representation phase. However, although Lyotard's philosophical framework changes, his dual project of describing the apparatuses of repression and repression and returning to the singular and irreducible as opposed to the unifying and representational remains. As Jeffrey Bennington had put it, quote, the bare project of the book Economy Libidinale, that of describing and situating dispositifs, and that of seeking out the possibility of singularities and events is never repudiated by Lyotard and is in his view fundamental to the task of philosophy, end quote. In his later work, however, and especially with its maturation in the differend, his philosophy is transformed from one that is ambivalent between its strategic and tactical commitments to one that is purely tactical. Economy libidinale is not unlike traditional anarchism, attempting to locate a single source of positivity from which resistance could be derived. Further, this positivity, though in direct opposition to anarchist humanism, shares with it the role of counterpoint to the prevailing social structure. For the anarchist, that structure is the network of repressions, while for Lyotard it is the representational character of understanding. Nevertheless, for both, it is a social structure that blocks the possibility of the full realization of experience. Thus, a powerful negativity or negative power looms large in both accounts. Although Lyotard's concept of libido is far more complex and subtle than the anarchist treatment of humanism, then the same strategic themes haunt both. For Lyotard, these themes were ultimately unacceptable, and his later philosophy can be seen as a reaction against them. Although slightly fuller treatments of Lyotard's view of language in the differend will be offered in the next chapter, it is worth noting here that the view remains an anti-humanist one. Language for Lyotard is composed of competing genres, which are bound not to subjective capacities or interests, but to social structures and historical contingencies. In other words, language is a place of struggle between different modes of its use, with different outcomes depending upon which mode prevails. Unlike semantic or syntactic approach to language that characterizes Anglo-American philosophy, Lyotard, like Deleuze, turns to a pragmatic approach, one that emphasizes the politics of linguistic appropriation rather than meaning or structure of linguistic units. And like reading this, I can tell why Wittgenstein's language games started to gain more and more prominence during this time. They're like, oh, language games, we can use this from the analytic philosophy stuff where we're talking about how different forces in language actually are related. Okay. That politics, however, is one that devolves upon practices, not upon the structures of language or subjective investments, both of which are results as much as causes of that politics. Thus, Lyotard's later work, rather than constituting a rejection of the anti-humanism of the libido, is instead an abandonment of the similarities to humanist naturalism that the concept still possesses. Latvian says, I'm glad you found something in your wheelhouse that seemed familiar. Well, this is like the most basic thing. I was saying how Wittgenstein was appropriated by other people. But I'm always for the Wittgenstein stuff, since if you don't know, I'm a bit of a Wittgensteinian. I always say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. A lot of what gets said about Wittgenstein is not specifically what he had in mind, but it's not like he would have been against it either, like interpreting his stuff that way. Marx says, this whole thing is good. What ruined it is just the psychoanalysis stuff. Again, different people are going to come at this from different directions. And so, I'm not angry about all the different things that got mentioned here. But, as long as you find something that goes, you find something good, then that's nice. But, we're almost done. Last paragraph. I didn't even kill myself getting over 3 hours. Lyotard, Deleuze, and Foucault share a refusal to view power as solely negative, repressive force. Alongside that refusal and intertwined with it, they share a rejection of subjectivity as a viable source of political action. What they develop instead of the perspective defined by these concepts, which we have called the a priori of traditional anarchism, is a new type of anarchism. This new anarchism retains the idea of intersecting and irreducible local struggles, of a wariness about representation of the political as investing the entire field of social relationships, and of the social as a network rather than a closed holism, a concentric field, or a hierarchy. Yet the new anarchism rejects the strategic basis that for traditional anarchism had formed the scaffolding of these ideas. It substitutes instead a perspective that is tactical all the way down. What we must seek to understand next are the general contours of this new anarchism, along with some of the specific theoretical interventions that characterize its project. Laffin says it's just doing the due diligence of pulling together all the folk that could in some way help an anti-humanist argument. He gives similar time to Anti-Oedipus, which is the magnum opus of I don't like psychoanalysis. Okay, fair. Yeah. Okay, but now we have read chapter 4 of The Political Philosophy of Post-Structuralist Anarchism by Todd May. It is time to rate what you thought about this chapter. As always, spam some emotes in chat. If you don't see them in your chat, you can see them below in mine. If you thought it was fun, gave you some ideas to think about, give it a brain dance. Spelling and capitalization do count here. And you can do more than one if you thought it was a lot of fun. Nog Scream for existential or artistic drama. I mean, this did touch on existentialism and stuff like that, and some social stuff. Nog Oro for the Ouroboros for deeper ancient ideas. Nog Knife, slicing and dicing arguments for complicated, like sophisticated argumentation. Nog Navel for navel gazing only for academics. Nog Turd, all style no substance, still poop underneath. And Nog Grapes for big claims that shrivel up, like if they didn't actually, get to what they said they were going to get to. You can also use the global vote yay and vote nay of Twitch, and my vote meh. Note that everything in the green, I do calculate an overall score, makes the overall score go up. Everything in the red makes it go down, and the vote meh actually pushes it towards the middle. Okay, so K-Par says brain dance, navel gazing, and scream. DeMarshall gave it a scream. Nafi Jesus gave it 3 navel gazing, a brain dance, and a scream. Fair. Like, Dojo gave it a brain dance. These are all fair. It's really trying to give us this existential, it's an existential argument because it's against the existentialist philosophers, but it's trying to get this sort of like, how are we actually supposed to interact with politics and like the self? So yeah. Anti-Snowman gave it a brain dance or Ouroboros and yay. Energy gave it a navel gazing, brain dance, yay, and a meh. Latvian says more inside baseball than I recalled. It always is. Dory says, this is my first brain dance. I really would like both read the book and learn more about what the hell he's talking about. Yeah. People give post-structuralism, continental philosophy a lot of shit. There are a lot of smart people that take it seriously. I mean, there's also a lot of shit people out there, but there's a reason people do it. They've got some good ideas, like some very smart people out there working on it. And it's like, if you haven't looked at it, and like I say this for all philosophy, if you don't like it, stop. Go read something else. But if you do find something you like, go take a look at it. Maybe you'll find something new to be interested in. That'd be really cool. Tinderos gave it a meh. Rockofowl gave it a scream and a yay. Lavi says, this book is what kicked me down the French postie tradition. It was your catalyst. Yeah, so there you go. Douglas says, I'm also not his audience, but I don't have history. Like I said, always in philosophy, there's always more to read. So if you find something interesting, read it. If you don't find it interesting anymore, stop. Unless you have a reason to finish it, because you really want to find out it for background or something. Okay, what am I going to say? I am the funny thing is, it's it's got some good ideas. I don't know how unique or interesting they are, just because I'm not in this area. Kind of the idea that, I knew the stuff from Foucault where knowledge is power. Power defines knowledge in some sense. So power is knowledge. I already knew that stuff. It is kind of a summary. It's kind of, it's I'm not exactly sure because it is textbooky. Feels like that a little bit for me. So I'm going to give it a brain dance. I thought it was fun. I didn't know a lot of this stuff. We're going to get some screams on this. But we're also, maybe a little nog navally. Yeah, something like that. And, and also for the inside baseball, that's getting a meh. But it's for the most part a decent paper. Doge says, I had to look up Carnap after you mentioned him in Holy Crap What a Life. Yeah, Carnap, he was dealing with bullshit in the 20th century, yeah. Koss said, I checked out and hopped into Discord with a bunch of hot cosplayers. That sounds like a, I can't, I always say, I love it for when people are here, but if you have to take care of other business or your health, go do that. That seems like a good use of your time, Koss. Auntie says, thanks for reading that laughing commentary. This helped me get a better idea of the productive side of the post-structuralism. This was perfect after that Foucault documentary. Cool. Mark says, interesting what you mentioned about the rise of language games. Yeah. I can see why after reading this sort of thing that they would, gravitate towards the later Wittgenstein when he's saying, look, it's not just the syntax and you can't just define it in the world, but there's something else going on. And giving a sort of an analytic backing to some of these concepts that are in this paper. So yeah, you can see the overlap there at least.